Bill Weinberg. I was born in 1962, so you do the math. And born in New York City, live in New York City. Well, I now live in the East Village, but I grew up in Jackson Heights, Queens, which was and is more so now, but also when I was growing up, very multicultural neighborhood. I say that every nationality on earth was represented in my high school student body. And I mean that literally. I really do. So that kind of, in some ways, gave me a head start in life. The joke is that when I was growing up in Jackson Heights back in the 70s, I kind of thought that it was very closed and provincial. And when I wanted a shot of alternative culture and youthful energy and a scene, so to speak, I would get on the F train into the East Village and go to CBGB and go to punk rock shows and so on. And now, for the past 40 years, I've been living here in the East Village, and it's completely gentrified and getting completely sterile. Whereas this whole scene, so to speak, is unfolded in Jackson Heights now, which has got great Bhangra music and rock and Espanol, and it's the center in the city of the Latin gay scene and whatnot. So now when I want a shot of authentic culture, I get on the F train in the other direction, going back to Jackson Heights. So how I first became politically aware. Well, I always say that the big turning point year was 1980. That was the year that I graduated from high school, Newtown High School in Elmhurst, Queens. And also the year of the Iran hostage crisis, the year that Reagan was elected, and the beginning of the country's big turn to the right. Although what we're looking at now is on a whole different level. But that was the beginning of the country's big turn to the right. And one of the ways that Carter kind of capitulated to the right in his final year in office that same year was bringing back draft registration, in addition to the contract for the MX missile and restoring military aid to El Salvador. Those were kind of the big three. But the one that really politicized me was bringing back draft registration. So I perceived that I was going to be I could be drafted. I was in the first post-Vietnam crop of 18-year-olds. That was the year I turned 18, who had to go down to the post office and register for the draft. I guess now it's done online. But then you had to go down to the post office. And that would really kind of gave me a sense of political urgency, having to go through that ritual. And that same year, or maybe it was the year before, through punk rock circles, I became aware of the Rock Against Racism movement. And again, I took the F train from Jackson Heights out to the East Village for the founding conference of the U.S. branch of the Rock Against Racism movement. I had already been aware of the British movement of that name because I was listening to the Clash and whatnot, and was aware that they were playing shows in London under the rubric of Rock Against Racism in response to, Enoch Powell and the National Front and the rise of the right and, Thatcherism and so on in Britain. And then I found out that there was going to be an American branch, and their founding meeting was going to be at a new rock club called Studio 10, just a few doors away from CBGB on Bleecker Street, near the corner of Bowery. And I went to that. I took the F train in, and I went to that, and got involved with them, and their rock club, Studio 10, kind of became my haunt in my senior year of high school. You take the subway in from Queens and go to rock shows there and whatnot, and eventually help them organize, free concerts in the parks and so on. And then it turned out that the anti-draft group that I had been involved in, New York Coalition Against Registration in the Draft, and Rock Against Racism, were both kind of attached to or in the orbit of a surviving remnant of the Yippies, a radical counterculture group from the 1960s. There was a surviving remnant of them who were just across Bleecker Street from Studio 10 at 9 Bleecker Street. Studio 10 was 10 Bleecker, and the collective where they lived and worked was at 9 Bleecker, or number 9, as we called it. And I eventually started using, their typesetting equipment for the anti-draft newsletter. And then I got involved in actually writing for their own underground newspaper, Overthrow. And that kind of set me on my trajectory as a radical journalist, which I remain today. The Yippies were pretty explicitly anarchist, not terribly ideological about it. But that same, I believe it was that summer, the summer of 1980, which was the first summer that I went cross country, was the summer that I started calling myself an anarchist. And I haven't looked back since then. I wound up at the Survival Gathering, which was organized by the American Indian Movement in the Black Hills of South Dakota. At that time, the uranium interest wanted to mine in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which is, of course, sacred Lakota territory. And the American Indian Movement organized this event out there to try to build opposition to that, bringing together supporters of Native American rights and the anti-nuclear movement and radical ecologists, etc., to try to build opposition. And in fact, it was successful. The uranium mining is actually in the Black Hills actually been held off for all these generations since then. Every once in a while, the industry gets together and tries to make a new offensive for their so-called nuclear renewal, but and kind of dust off these plans to mine for uranium in the Black Hills. But it never actually happened, which is a good thing. So I wound up out there, and there I sort of fell in with people, including Native American anarchists who explicitly, identified with the ideology. And I think that's when I first started calling myself an anarchist. And in the subsequent years, I got involved in the anti-nuclear movement. The summer after that, 81, I continued cross-country all the way out to California for the first time. And I was involved in the blockade of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, trying to prevent it from coming back online, which unfortunately was not successful. It's still online today. They were going to close it a couple of years ago, and then they decided to keep it open in light of, climate change, which to my mind is a really, really terrible, terrible decision. The sort of false choice which has been forced upon us by the powers that be between two bad options, nuclear power and fossil fuels. But nonetheless, it was because every time they tried to open a new plant like Diablo Canyon, starting in 81, I think it finally opened in 84 or 85. But, all those years where, there were constant protests against it. And just before that, the Seabrook plant here on the East Coast, I'd been aware of the protest there in New Hampshire. That was while I was still in high school. I didn't actually attend, but I was aware. Every time they tried to bring a new plant online, there was sustained protest. And I think that was a part of what finally did in the nuclear industry. And it really went into abeyance. And their very hubristic plans to bring on something like 100 new reactors in this country were cut short in the 1980s. And, I take some credit for that. Me and my friends in the movement that I was a part of, I think we can take some credit for that. Although, as I say, now there's periodically there's been all this talk of a so-called nuclear renewal. And in fact, Governor Hochul here in New York State has just announced that she wants to build a new nuclear power plant, and we're going to have to fight her on that. So she hasn't yet chosen a location for it. It's still in the phase of, just talk. Hopefully, it's not going to go much further than that. But if it does, we're going to have to fight her on that. And unfortunately, in the intervening years, there's been this whole generation which has come up, which has just, been hammered with the propaganda that nuclear power is an alternative to fossil fuels, and has, for completely 100% legitimate reasons, has got a very pressing sense of urgency about the climate crisis, of course. But they've been hammered with this propaganda that nuclear power is some kind of alternative, which emphatically it is not. And they're unaware, or seemingly unaware, or only vaguely aware of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, etc., which are very, very dramatic and pressing arguments against nuclear power. On top of, even apart from the risk of accidents, the whole functioning of the industry is inherently genocidal. Indigenous lands are plundered and poisoned to mine the uranium to begin with, all over the world, from the 4 corner areas of the American Southwest to Niger and Mali, and where the French are mining for uranium in North Africa, etc. Routine emissions from the normal functioning of nuclear power plants. And finally, the completely irresolvable dilemma of what to do with the waste, which is going to remain deadly for further into the human future than biblical times stretch into the past, like exponentially further. So I continue to be adamantly opposed to nuclear power, and it fills me with a certain degree of angst that people have kind of gone to sleep on this issue, and the industry is trying to exploit this, and we may have to fight that one all over again on top of everything else that we have to fight now, which is a very, very great deal at this moment, obviously. Like I say, my first experiences with it were writing for Overthrow, the Yippie publication, which was published between, I believe, 1979 and 1988. I particularly wrote about the anti-nuclear movement for them and about Native American issues. The very first story that I did for them was that same year, 1980, after the Black Hills. I wound up at a Chippewa reservation in northern Wisconsin called Mole Lake. I actually went there for a bluegrass festival, which is being held on the reservation. But I became aware that similarly, Exxon wanted to mine for uranium in Chippewa territory up in northern Wisconsin, which would have polluted the headwaters of the Wolf River and completely destroyed the traditional Chippewa economy based on harvesting of wild rice. So I actually I wrote a piece about that. That was the first piece of published journalism that I ever did. And then later in the 1980s, and they are also kind of a victory because Exxon never actually did mine for uranium up at Mole Lake. So that's good. Then later I kind of followed the gringo trail, so to speak, and these, lefty gringo types who are going down to Central America to witness the whole, revolutionary struggles that were unfolding there in the 1980s. And I did some writing for Overthrow about that from Guatemala and Nicaragua and so on. Again, trying to emphasize more indigenous struggle and less, the whole sort of like, Marxist, Leninist, vanguardist leadership of the movements, which the, sort of like the mainstream left, so to speak, was dogmatically in support of, and I was critical of. And ultimately, out of that work came my first book, War on the Land, Ecology and Politics in Central America, which was published by Zed Books in, I believe, 1991. By that point, I had also started doing a column for a local weekly newspaper here in Lower Manhattan called Downtown. By that time, I was already living in the East Village. I moved into this apartment where I'm talking right now in 1989, same year that the Berlin Wall came down, and we'll get to that later. But also the year that the Tompkins Square Park uprising was going on here in the East Village, or the Lower East Side, Alphabet City area, just to the east of here. By 1988, which was the year before that, the year before I moved into this apartment, but I was already hanging out in the neighborhood by that time. I was living in Brooklyn before I moved in here. but I was already hanging out in the neighborhood and writing for Downtown. 1988, there was a tremendous crisis of homelessness in New York City at this time, something like 100,000 homeless people, because first, all of this housing stock had been destroyed during the landlord arson and eviction of the urban blight period of the 1970s. And then with the so-called economic recovery and the gentrification of the 1980s, there was a second wave of displacement. Working people could not keep pace with the rising rents. And the homeless folks started establishing little encampments in a piece of land that they could find around New York City. And in the summer of 1988, they moved into Tompkins Square Park and started pitching tents and erected an encampment. And immediately what happened is that by this time, a lot of the empty buildings in the neighborhood were being taken over by squatters and anarchists. And there was this whole, something like 20 buildings were being occupied by squatters at that time. The building where I'm living, it was never actually vacant. I didn't move in here as a squatter, but when I moved in 88, it had essentially been abandoned by the landlord. And we were on rent strike, and there wasn't any heat or hot water. So for the first 3 years, I think it was, that I was living here, it was kind of like squatting. We were on rent strike. We weren't paying any rent. And we were in court against the landlord because he hadn't lived up to his end of the bargain. And, he wasn't maintaining the building. And eventually we won our case against the landlord, and the city took over the building. And at that point, we, meaning the tenants association here in the building, we had the opportunity to take the building over and to become a legal homestead under the homesteading program, which had been established for, all these abandoned properties around the city at that time. But the tenants association, we were just organized enough to prevail in the rent strike. When it came down to actually taking over the building, we kind of got factionalized and started fighting amongst each other. And eventually the city got tired of dealing with it and just flipped it to a new landlord. So at that time, I got a new lease. I got a lease, which I didn't have when I moved in. So now I'm just a tenant paying rent to a landlord. But the way the rent laws work in New York City is that your rent goes up by a certain increment every time you sign a new lease. And because we were on rent strike for the first 3 or 4 years I was living here, I didn't get a new lease. And when I got the new lease, the rent just went up by 1 increment, which is why I still have very, very, disgracefully good rent for this neighborhood. I'm what they call the privileged poor. So that's how I can get away with living as a freelance writer and a podcaster and a blogger. And I actually do a weekly historical walking tour of the radical history of the Lower East Side for the Museum of Reclaimed Urban Space over on Avenue C, 155 Avenue C, between 9th and 10th Streets, every Saturday and Sunday at 3 p.m. I take people around and I talk about the squats in the community gardens and so on. And there were 11 squats which survived the wave of squatter evictions. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself in the story. But those 11 buildings became legal homesteads, and they survive even now, including C Squat, the building that the museum is in. Anyway, getting back, that deal was worked out like a decade after the period we're talking about. Getting back to 1988. So, sorry about my non-linear history here, but anyway, getting back to 1988. So this was what really set off the Lower East Side uprising. In response to the homeless establishing an encampment in the park, in Tompkins Square Park, the administration of Mayor Ed Koch said, okay, we have to start imposing curfews in the parks. Up until this point, all the parks have been open 24/7. Now Mayor Ed Koch says, okay, we're going to impose a curfew in all the parks, starting in Tompkins Square Park. All the parks are going to close at 1 o'clock in the morning. But the local anarchists in the neighborhood say, no, we're not going to have this. We're going to resist the curfew and the eviction of the homeless encampment. And on the first night the curfew was to be enforced, August 6, 1988, Avenue A filled up with riot police wearing helmets and shields and full-on gear with their sticks ready to rock and roll. And Tompkins Square filled up with anarchists wearing bicycle helmets and shields made improvised from garbage can lids with rocks and bottles and brickmen and saved for the occasion, also ready to rock and roll. And sure enough, the obvious happened at 1 o'clock in the morning. The police came in, tried to clear the park. The anarchists fought back and it exploded in what we still call today the Tompkins Square Park riot, although there had been some before, going all the way back to the 1800s, as I learned later. And there's been many since. But on that night, the police really went overboard. The fighting immediately spilled out onto Avenue A, and the police attacked anybody who was on the street, not just protesters, anybody. They viciously attacked with their nightsticks, and all of Avenue A was a war zone all night long, and the police brought out helicopters, and a lot of people were hospitalized. And after that, there was a big public outcry. There were all these terrible pictures in the media the next day of people whose faces had been bloodied by the police. And even the local community board 3, the lowest level of government in New York City, which had sort of been going along with the curfew before the riot. After the riot, they say, no, we weren't properly consulted. This violates the city charter. So the city was forced to rescind the curfew. And the park stayed open 24/7, and the homeless encampment stayed. And initially, it was a real victory. And then, ironically, the city government started imposing curfews in all the other parks around New York City, but they couldn't get away with it in Tompkins Square, the first park where they tried, and the park that gave them the impetus to start imposing curfews in the first place. So this was the beginning of the 3 years that I call the class war period on the Lower East Side, or the Lower East Side, the Intifada. I should explain that Lower East Side was like the Latino rendering of Lower East Side when the Puerto Ricans started moving in the 50s and the 60s. They started calling the neighborhood Lower East Side, the Latinoization of Lower East Side. And the Intifada, of course, the first Intifada was going on the West Bank and Gaza in the same period in the late 1980s. So we facetiously, or not so facetiously, called the uprising the Lower East Side, the Intifada. And I was doing a weekly column for this local community newspaper called Downtown and covering the whole movement. Oh, yeah, I should say that the last Tompkins Square Park riot so far was Memorial Day 1991. And on that day, something really bad happened. It could have been the work of paid police agents. We don't know. It could have just been hotheads. But in any event, a convenience store on Avenue A was ransacked and looted. And not even some kind of like upscale yuppie boutique that you could sort of consider a legitimate target, but just an ordinary, unassuming convenience store run by Pakistani immigrants had its windows broken and was looted. And after that, the city administration said, of David Dinkins, by the way, the new mayor who had been elected as a progressive, saying he was going to help the homeless, but never did very much, said enough is enough. The park is closed for renovations. So the police shut down the park. They built a big 20-foot fence around the park to keep people out. The bulldozers moved in. Community Board 3 went to court to try to get an injunction to get the park back open, saying they hadn't been consulted and violated the city charter once again. But the judge found it was an emergency situation, wouldn't give them an injunction. So the park stayed closed. And for those 2 years that the park was closed, that put an end to the uprising. That really broke the movement. It defeated the movement because this was just before the advent of the internet. Today, you can organize a flash mob on your phone. Back then, you really needed a gathering point to sustain a protest movement. And during the 2 years that we didn't have the park, the protest movement was just defeated, and the gentrification just swept like a wave with little resistance. And today, the neighborhood has been pretty well gentrified. There's, on the other side of Avenue D, the last avenue before the East River, you still got the public housing projects built back, I believe, in the 60s, which are the last solid bastion of working class housing in the neighborhood. And you still got those 11 squats which survive and some homesteads which survive. But by and large, the neighborhood has been pretty well gentrified. So we put up a real fight for a period of around 3 years. We were very badly defeated in the end. Later in the 1990s, when the city started destroying the community gardens, that reignited activism in the neighborhood and elsewhere in the city as well. People got organized again to defend the community gardens, and this time in a more idealistic, nonviolent, ecologically conscious form, as opposed to the whole kind of like mass, black-clad, bottle-throwing, nihilistic ethic of the 1980s. By that time, a couple of things happened which had sort of opened the new chapter in my life. One was I started writing for High Times magazine. I eventually became news editor at High Times magazine, the magazine of the cannabis culture, which had actually been founded by a veteran yippie, Tom Prasad, back in the 1970s. So it's kind of an obvious trajectory that I started out with the yippies and then wound up writing for High Times magazine. I started aggressively covering the whole movement for cannabis legalization, and which has now, made tremendous progress in the years since then. And there's also the Zapatista uprising in Mexico in 1994, which I actually got a travel budget to go down and cover it from High Times magazine, and spent much of the 1990s going back and forth between here and Mexico, covering the Zapatistas and related, indigenous struggles in Mexico, both for High Times magazine and for Native America's Quarterly, which is being published by the American Indian program at Cornell University. I started writing for them as well out of that same work. And a lot of the militarization, which in fact was directed against the Zapatistas, was in the guise of drug enforcement, because there was a lot of cannabis being grown in the mountains of southern Mexico, even though the Zapatistas were not growing it. They actually had a very puritanical anti-drug attitude. But nonetheless, that was a ready excuse for, their territories to be militarized. So more covering the drug war angle for High Times and more covering the indigenous angle for Native Americans, but, reporting on the same stuff for both of them throughout the 1990s. Ultimately, out of that work came my second book, Homage to Chiapas, The New Indigenous Struggles in Mexico, which was published by Verso in the year 2000. It was in the 1980s. In the 1980s that I also became aware, just through anarchist circles in New York City, of the Libertarian Book Club, and got involved with them. They were they kind of really became my activist home for several years, from the mid to late 80s through the mid to late 90s, I would say. And they were, more ideologically anarchist. They were, I should explain the word libertarian, because that word is actually, the meaning of it has changed over the generations. Now there sort of was a hostile takeover of that word by the free market right, by the Libertarian Party and the laissez-faire capitalist right in the 1960s. But that word actually emerged from the anarchist left. The Libertarian Book Club was actually founded in the 1940s by anarchist exiles, mostly Jews and Italians, from fascist Europe, fleeing Hitler and Mussolini, who came here to New York City. We believe in 1946, they established the Libertarian Book Club to, sort of keep the ideology alive. Now, they called themselves libertarian socialists as opposed to libertarian capitalists. Now, to a certain extent, there was a euphemistic element to this, because, it was the beginning of the Cold War and the anti-communist hysteria and so on. I think, they didn't want to attract too much attention by calling themselves anarchists. So they called themselves libertarians or libertarian socialists. To a certain extent, there was a euphemistic element to it. But, libertarian socialism also explains what their ideology was. So even though it's slightly euphemistic, I'm not really opposed to it, because it isn't obscuring the meaning. In some ways, it's kind of clarifying the meaning. People who believed in socialism, in society organized around meeting human needs rather than personal profit, but not being opposed from above by politburos and commissars, but being organized from below. So, and their big points of inspiration, of course, would have been the Makhnovists in Ukraine, and the original Zapatistas in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution in that same period, Russian Revolution, Mexican Revolution. Then the Spanish anarchists in Catalonia and Barcelona, 1936 being the year that they actually seized power there, or abolished power, depending on how you want to look at it. And then I would argue, the neo-Zapatistas in, starting in 1994, further south in Mexico, in Chiapas, near the Guatemalan border. And then, again, kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but we could talk about Rojava and the Syrian revolution and so on. We'll get to that later. That beginning about, going 14 years ago now. So, but meanwhile, getting back to the 1980s, I got involved with the Libertarian Book Club, and I eventually became one of the key people who was keeping it alive. So, again, it had been founded by like these real old school, like classical anarchists. There was even one guy, Jack Frazier, who was among the founders, who had actually met Emma Goldman. Apparently, I went, made the pilgrimage up to Toronto, where she lived in exile in the final years of her life, and actually met Emma Goldman. So, we actually claimed the lineage all the way back to Emma Goldman. So, and there were, a few others who I actually was privileged to meet of, these real old school cats, from the 1930s and 40s who survived into the 1980s. And I got to know them, Sam Dolgoff, Abe Bluestein, Valerio Isca, etc. But as the old cats, these first generation Libertarian Book Club guys, began to get old and to die. There was kind of a second generation that came in, people, from the new left and post-situationism, so to speak, people who were inspired by the Situationist International, Guy Debord, and Society of the Spectacle, and all that. Kind of came in as a kind of a second generation, and breathed new life into the LBC. And that's where I got to know a lot of the other people who you've interviewed, was in the LBC. And also where I got to know Peter Lamborn Wilson, who he was, in as much as we had a star, he was kind of like the star. He held the annual Chaos Day lecture every December, which is always our biggest draw of the year. That was primarily our primary activity, was organizing a monthly lecture series that we called the Anarchist Forum. That was ultimately the compromise. We kind of went through this identity crisis about the word libertarian because there was so much confusion about it. But we didn't want to change the name to Anarchist Book Club because we wanted to, maintain some deference to the founders whose shoulders we were standing on, who had named it the Libertarian Book Club. So ultimately, the compromise was it was the Libertarian Book Club, but the event that we organized each month was the Anarchist Forum. So that was largely that was our activity, organizing this monthly forum. And the last one of the year we called Chaos Day, and Peter Lamborn Wilson, was always spoke then. And that was always the biggest draw of the year, that we get, up to 100 people as opposed to, or even more, as opposed to, maybe 20 or 30 people. So, and I got to know him. He was at that time producing a radio show on WBAI called the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. That's all. The name in itself is a whole story, which I guess I can get to. But at a certain point, WBAI, being the Pacifica Network station, nonprofit, listener-supported radio here in New York City. And I sort of came in as his understudy. And eventually, he kind of got tired of doing the radio show. More and more, he was traveling, and I would sit in for him when he was out of town. But eventually he retired from doing it altogether, and I kind of took it over. And then I brought in some other folks from the LBC, and we kind of formed a collective, most prominently Anne-Marie Hendrickson, who you might also want to interview, actually, and Sharon Gregory, and Bob McGill became our engineer. So we kind of had a collective going for a while, and I was doing, we were doing the radio show every week. Let's see. I mean, from 1988, I believe that's when Peter launched it, until finally it was canceled in 2011, and we'll get to that because that again kind of opened up a new chapter of my life. But I should explain the name, I guess. Are you aware of Moorish science and the Moorish Orthodox Church and all that? All right. This is Moorish science was kind of a precursor movement to the Black Muslims, founded in 1917 by a guy by the name of the Noble Drew Ali, or the Prophet Noble Drew Ali, who kind of adopted, he sort of propounded the theory that Black folk in America were actually Moors and inheritors of the great Moorish civilization, and kind of adopted an aesthetic, kind of a Moorish and Islamic aesthetic, without actually being, Islamic or Muslim in any sense, which would be accepted by, the ulema, so to speak, or by Al-Azhar University. But they were kind of a precursor movement to the Black Muslims in the Nation of Islam. Eventually, Noble Drew's fire would be stolen by Elijah Muhammad. This is all the book, The Messenger, the biography of Elijah Muhammad. It goes into all of this history, the early chapters especially. But even though the Moorish science movement was eventually eclipsed by the Nation of Islam, it continued to survive and survives today. And back in the early 1960s, Peter Lamborn Wilson was among a group of kind of like, young white beatnik dropout types who were really into Sufi poetry and Persian poetry and Sufi mysticism and whatnot, who became aware of the Moorish Science Temple and fell in with them and was kind of given a franchise by a particular Moorish Science Temple in Baltimore and formed the Moorish Orthodox Church, which was in some ways a joke religion, so to speak, but it also had kind of a serious element to it. He eventually made his journey to the east. He traveled overland all the way from in the late 60s, early 70s, from Morocco to India through Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan and so on. Eventually he settled in Iran, where he lived, involved in theater work and so on until the Iranian Revolution, when he came back to New York. And again, that same year, just as, things were getting heavy and the country was moving to the right, kind of got more politicized. Before that, he had been a kind of like mystical, quietistic anarchist. After that, he became more of a political activist anarchist and fell in with the Libertarian Book Club, as did I. That's where I got to know him. So that explains that. So when I inherited the radio show, again, I kind of, in deference to Peter, I kind of kept the name, even though originally it didn't really make that much sense to me. But I kind of feel that over the years, I kind of grew into it. I should say that, I'm an atheist and I consider myself a rationalist. Nonetheless, I've always been very interested in mysticism and spirituality. If that's a contradiction, it's one that I'm comfortable with. I think that, there's a biological basis to it. I don't believe in a supreme being, but I do believe in the mystical experience. And I eventually joined the Moorish Orthodox Church and took a Moorish name. I'm not going to mention it at the moment. I'll just say that I've done some writing under it. So if people really want to figure out what it is, they can probably figure it out. I should also note that Peter Lamborn Wilson has been associated with the writer Hakeem Bey, author of The Temporary Autonomous Zone. Some people theorize that they're one and the same person. The next big turning point in my life would be 9/11. I was actually here in Lower Manhattan for 9/11. I witnessed the towers burning. I lived in the toxic air for, months thereafter, literally months. I'd never been aware of which way the wind was blowing before, but for months, that whole winter, whenever the wind was blowing up from ground zero up here to the East Village, I could tell because the air would have this acrid smell to it. Very, very spooky. So that was the beginning of the next big lurch to the right in American society with, the neocon ascendants and W. Bush and his paroxysm of hyper-imperialism, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. So it was in response to that I launched my website, initially as a kind of like a watchdog on the global war on terrorism. It started out with a different name. The name has changed over the years, but I'll just give the name that it's had for the past decade or so, which is Counter Vortex. Now the scope has expanded somewhat to cover small wars, which are getting insufficient media attention, and particularly autonomy struggles and indigenous movements and the struggles of land-rooted peoples around the world. The idea behind it is that, the world is kind of spinning into this vortex of ecological collapse, permanent war, and totalitarianism. And through our resistance, we can begin to build a counter vortex and get things moving in the other direction towards ecological sustainability, human freedom, and autonomy. And should we be so lucky, peace. So that's the idea behind it, or, fighting militarism, at least anti-militarism. So that's kind of the idea behind the name, which is also turned into my my weekly podcast. I started doing the podcast after I lost the radio show, and I guess I should jump forward to 2011. Two significant things happened that year, which opened up yet another chapter of my life. Well, one is that was the year that the Arab Revolution began. Starting in Tunisia, then Egypt, Libya, Syria, Bahrain, etc. And, I had already been very active and vocal in, opposing what we call the tanky left, that element of the sectarian Leninist left in the United States, which always supports Russian tanks. Whether it was in, Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968, Afghanistan in 1979, or, then Russian warplanes in Syria starting in 2015, when Putin intervened on behalf of the genocidal dictatorship of Bashar Assad. And WBAI had sort of been going in this direction of really getting more and more in bed with these tanky sectarian groups, and also spreading all of this ugly conspiracy theory about how, space aliens with Jewish last names were behind 9/11. And I'm not joking. I mean that entirely literally. And also promoting health quackery, Gary Null, and so on, very, very aggressively, as, they would give out premiums, as they called them, these fundraising premiums. People would make a donation to the station, and in exchange, they would get a DVD in the mail, of some crank like David Icke talking about, how Jewish space aliens blew up the World Trade Center. And they said that they needed the money, and that this was the way to get the money, by appealing to the lowest common denominator like this. Adding insult to injury, there was such a backlog and so much chaos at the station that they often wouldn't even send out the premium. So the listeners were actually getting ripped off, in addition to being sold snake oil. So I started vocally opposing this on my radio show. By this point, it had kind of fallen on my shoulders. By this point, I was doing it pretty much by myself. And I was, vocally opposing this on the radio show and kind of like making it a platform of a dissent from this very ugly direction that the station was going in. And ultimately, they canceled the show, and that was the end of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. And that's when I launched shortly after that, I launched the podcast. I should say that later on, they brought a WBAI, which continued to stumble on in spite of its perennial difficulties and constant purges and financial troubles. It continued to stumble on. And Anne-Marie Hendrickson, who had been my co-host on the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade, was later brought back. She's continuing to produce a show there called Mansion for a Rat. It's, I believe, a reference to a poem from E. Cummings. So she is still on the radio. I'm not anymore. I'm just, trying to squeeze a dime off of the internet with my podcast like every other idiot. So I guess before I, having brought up Anne-Marie, I should talk about our activity with neither East nor West back in the end game of the Cold War, and having also brought up the tankies, and opposing them before we get to the Arab Spring. So let me jump back. I'm sorry, again, I'm kind of jumping around. This is not linear, but let's go back now to 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, through the mid-1990s, I would say. That was the period of my time working with neither East nor West, which was a group which Anne-Marie and our late buddy Bob McGlynn had co-founded with some other people, which was trying to organize support for the dissidents in the Soviet Union and the East Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, who took a neither nor position regarding the East and the West, and did not have illusions about about NATO and the West and the United States, but took a rigorous neither nor position. And, were anarchists, feminists, anti-nuclear activists, ecologists, and so on, and wanted to, have some kind of, socialism with a human face, so to speak. And, rather than just, a capitalist restoration. So we were doing support work for them. I first became aware of them, Anne-Marie and Bob McGlynn, actually, after the Chernobyl disaster. They actually did a direct action in Moscow, if you can believe it or not. Moscow being, very, very closed at that time. I guess Gorbachev was already in power, but it was still very, very closed. So they actually smuggled in, what year would this have been? I think it probably would have been 87, the year after the Chernobyl accident. It's on my website. It's on Counter Vortex. Bob McGlynn actually wrote up a kind of a memoir of his work with neither East nor West. You can look it up there, or you can interview Anne-Marie and she can tell you the whole story. But they actually smuggled in, they went there as tourists, but they smuggled in a banner reading something to the effect of, they timed it for Hiroshima Day, or very close to Hiroshima Day. And the banner said something to the effect of, no more Chernobyls, no more Hiroshimas, no nuclear power, environmental sanity, East and West. Words to that effect. And also they gave out, they had flyers, which they smuggled in Russian, about the dangers of radiation. And they immediately went to Gorky Park and unfolded the banner and started giving out the flyers. And of course, they managed, to get away with it for something like 15 minutes before they were arrested by the KGB and deported back to the United States. So I thought that was an absolutely amazing, brilliant, heroic action, and I got involved with their group, neither East nor West, which I believe they actually founded shortly after they got back to New York from that expedition. So every time a draft resistor or an anti-nuclear activist or whatnot was arrested or had his or her passport taken away in the Soviet Union or Poland, we would organize a vigil outside the Soviet or Polish consulate here in New York City, and we even paired the Tompkins Square struggle with struggles in the East Bloc, and tried. There was a Kenny Tolia was one of the Tompkins Square Park defendants. He was arrested and actually sentenced to prison for his activity in one of the Tompkins Square Park riots in that period. And we actually got activists in the East Bloc to protest at the American embassy, I believe, in Poland, on his behalf. And we organized, at the Polish embassy here in New York City on behalf of Polish activists. Again, the name escapes me. It's on my website. So there was the war in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia fell apart. And we started doing support work for the activists in each one of the former Yugoslav republics who rejected ethnic nationalism and wanted ethnic coexistence and were, resisting the draft. And, people who had actually been, kind of like, left-wing and anarchist dissidents under Tito were now, continuing to resist and protest, the new ethno-nationalist regimes, which came to power in Croatia and in Serbia and in Bosnia and Slovenia, et cetera. So doing, that same kind of solidarity work with them. And this also entailed, this was really when the whole struggle against Batankis began, because Batankis, particularly around the Workers' World Party at that time, were like militantly in support of Slobodan Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic and the Serbs, and literally rallying around the genocidal regime. So we were kind of taking them on, and in the journalistic work and radio work I was doing in this time, kind of like aggressively taking them on. And similarly, after the invasion of Iraq, trying to challenge their attempted, grab for the leadership of the anti-war effort. And then I guess we could jump forward to, once again, back to 2011 and the Arab Spring. So just like the damn Tankies had been dogmatically in support of Slobodan Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, then with the Iraq invasion in 2003 and the subsequent years, they were like dogmatically in support of Saddam Hussein. And then with the beginning of the Syrian revolution, they were dogmatically in support of Bashar Assad, who similarly was escalating to genocide, literally escalating to genocide in the same period. We all know about the poison gas attacks, but there was also, the mass killing that went on in his prison gulag, serial massacres. And, the Tankies were kind of like in this very contradictory position, because on one hand, they felt that they had to support the revolutions in the Arab states, which were in the U.S. camp, like Egypt. They supported the revolution against Mubarak, but they felt that they had to oppose the revolutions in Syria and Libya, which, where the dictatorships were kind of like maintaining this anti-U.S. posture. Even though all of these, revolutionary movements throughout the Arab world, in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and Syria alike, all saw themselves as in solidarity with each other and united and just opposed the dictatorship, regardless of where, of what geopolitical camp it fell in. Pro-democracy movements first and foremost. And, not caught up in this whole, Cold War campist mentality, but finally, getting over that garbage So, but of course, the situation was complicated by by the U.S. intervention in Libya, which of course they opposed, and then by the Russian intervention in Syria, which of course they supported. So I actually wound up in a group called Syria Solidarity New York City, which was together with New York area Syrian immigrants and Syrian Americans, including my good friend Amina Ali, somebody else you could consider interviewing. It's actually half Syrian and half Puerto Rican. Interesting mixture. So, and we organized a weekly protest in Union Square every Friday, kind of in solidarity with the weekly Friday protest against Bashar Assad in Syria. And unfortunately, during this same period, the tanky line became more and more hegemonic on the left. And the politics of the left just really, really deteriorated. Because back in the 90s, when the sectarians were rallying around Slobodan Milosevic, it was really just the sectarians. It was Workers' World Party, and then later their offshoot, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which is very ironically named. It should really be the Party for Fascism and Dictatorship. But then, since the Arab Spring, which you would have thought would have, injected new life into the more, liberatory currents in the left, and it just the opposite effect. And the tanky line actually became hegemonic and was taken up more and more by The Nation magazine, Democracy Now!, etc. It just kind of became the consensus position of the left establishment in this country. So it became more and more in those years a kind of like a dissident within the left, or a dissident from the left. I call myself an anarchist. I still do call myself an anarchist after all these years. I always feel the need to preface that by saying that I'm not a doctrinaire anarchist. I'm not a dogmatic anarchist. I consider myself to be a pragmatic anarchist, and definitely not a sectarian anarchist. And it's kind of insufficient at this point, I feel, to just be, an anarchist dissident to the mainstream left, as the mainstream left has gotten more and more wrongheaded and reactionary over the past decade or so. Or now, I'd say really 2011, year of the Arab Revolution, was really the turning point year. So what is that? That's 14 years at this point, right? 15 years. No, 14 years, right? So it's kind of become more important to stress, but, my critique is not just an anarchist critique. It's just a fundamental critique, which is rooted in human rights and just, pro-democracy principles. And some people call, anarchism or anarchy to be, democracy taken seriously. I mean, the kind of democracy that I, propound or, try to work for, to advocate is, not formalistic bourgeois representative democracy, but, a radical, grassroots democracy from below, organic democracy. But, just the word democracy is like sufficient enough to oppose these, elements which are, literally rallying around dictatorships and genocidal dictatorships at that. So, first and foremost, it's a critique which is pro-democracy and pro-human rights. And to a certain extent, for tactical reasons, I kind of have to downplay the anarchism and make people understand that, no, you should not just dismiss what I'm saying as a sectarian anarchism, because it's actually something a lot more fundamental than that. So, but similarly, the our group, Serious Solidarity, New York City, there were anarchists in it. I call myself an anarchist. I believe that Amina calls herself an anarchist, or she has at times, at least. um, but we were not, an anarchist group. And neither was East nor West exactly. It was kind of anarchist oriented or, anarchist influenced, anarchist leaning. But, it also supported, democratic socialists and feminists and so on. And, similarly, during the whole struggle over Iraq for the decade or so after the invasion, I actually got involved in supporting kind of like a dissident Marxist group in Iraq around there was the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq, which was kind of like a feminist group which was opposing both the U.S. occupation and the jihadist insurgents who were trying to, impose a, theocratic rule, regardless of whether they were Sunni or Shiite. Oh, yeah, right. It was the Worker Communist Party of Iraq, the Hekmatyar group, kind of in the Marxist humanist tradition, kind of like dissident Marxist, not Leninist. So, again, if there were anarchists to support, I would have supported them too. But, the situation was sufficiently desperate, and, there needed to be some kind of, secular, just basically liberatory, neither nor position to support in Iraq. I supported them. I actually met some of their leadership and interviewed them. Actually went to Japan for an anti-war conference where some of their people attended, and I got to know them and interviewed them. One of the last pieces of journalism that I did for The Nation before today, I would not write for The Nation, even if they would have me, and they wouldn't, because I think their politics have just become too sinister. One of the last pieces that I wrote for The Nation was actually about the civil resistance in Iraq. It's kind of like, Marxist and feminist civil resistance in Iraq. Not anarchist, but nonetheless, I supported them. So, but then again, jumping forward to the Arab Revolution, okay, anarchists became involved in supporting the Rojava Kurds, who in 2012, I believe it was, as the rule of the Assad dictatorship collapsed in the Rojava region of northeast Syria. The Kurds kind of, established their autonomous zone and their self-rule there. Again, like the Zapatistas in Mexico, not explicitly anarchist, but definitely anarchist influenced, explicitly anarchist influenced. They acknowledge their anarchist influence. Kind of in the ideological orbit of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey, which is now just disbanded. But as you're probably aware, their leader, Abdullah Öcalan, in prison, kind of underwent this political conversion and repudiated Leninism and separatism in favor of, this kind of radical municipalist / anarchist approach informed by the Zapatistas and by Murray Bookchin, the Vermont eco-anarchist. So the Rojava Kurds, who sexually seized power, or again, abolished power, depending on how you look at it, although they were not as explicitly anarchist as their forebears in Spain in 1936 had been, nonetheless established an autonomous zone in northeast Syria. I think that, the political project they put in place there is definitely worthy of support and very inspiring and very interesting. But because they had been influenced by Murray Bookchin, a well-known white American anarchist, a lot of white American anarchists became interested in the Rojava Kurds and supporting them. But they were not aware that there was an anarchist element to the general Arab-led Syrian revolution as well. Particularly, there was an Arab Syrian anarchist revolutionary theorist by the name of Omar Aziz, who was one of the early founders of the protest movement and the Arab Revolution in Syria back in 2011, and he really sort of formulated the whole model of local coordination committees, as they were called, similar to the Grupos de Afinidad, or affinity groups, in Spain back in the 1930s, which were also the structure, we call them affinity groups in English, also the structure of the anti-nuclear movement and the blockades of, the nuclear power plants that I was involved in back in the 1980s. Similar, that same word. It was the same concept applied in Syria. They called themselves the local coordination committees. Just, groups of friends and neighbors in, their own locales in Syria who first started organizing the protest against Assad. And then as his regime began to collapse, actually organizing local rule and the organization of society in the areas where the opposition was able to seize power. So Omar Aziz, of course, was arrested and died in Assad's prisons. But the movement that he founded lived on with a very strong anarchistic current. Again, I'm not going to say anarchist, but explicitly anarchist influenced. But because, Omar Aziz was not, a well-known white American anarchist thinker like Murray Bookchin, people in the West were not aware of him. And there was not, the same imperative to support the general Arab-led Syrian revolution that there was to support the Rojava Kurdish revolution. And then, of course, the situation got complicated by with Assad's really bloody repression, eventually genocidal repression. It turned into an armed conflict, of course, and the opposition initially started forming, armed self-defense committees, which eventually became the Free Syrian Army, which eventually fractured and became, various armed opposition groups, some of which were more secular and pro-democratic, others of which were more Islamist. One of which, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was just involved in the seizure of power that we just saw in Syria with the fall of the dictatorship, finally, just last December. But during this whole period, then Syria kind of became a chessboard for the global powers. First, Russia intervened on behalf of the dictatorship. Then the U.S. intervened against ISIS. Not against the dictatorship, but against ISIS. The U.S. carried out, there were a couple of token airstrikes against the regime after chemical attacks on two occasions in April of 2017 and 2018. And that got a lot of attention. What didn't get a lot of attention is that the U.S. actually bombed the city of Raqqa into rubble because it was the de facto capital of ISIS during the same period that the Russians were bombing the city of Aleppo virtually into rubble because it was in the hands of the more secular oriented rebels at that time. And again, as I say, the sort of tanky line in support of the regime, or at least painting all of the Arab as opposed to Kurdish opposition to Assad as, monolithically jihadist or CIA astroturf, which was dangerous bunk. That became more and more the hegemonic line on the left generally. So I found, and it was even taken up by elements of the anarchist left here in the United States. And particularly when, unfortunately, it turned into armed conflict between the Rojava Kurds and elements of the Arab rebels. Okay, I should say that one thing that, stateside anarchists who were in support of the Rojava Kurds have been very, very reluctant to acknowledge is that the Rojava Kurds kind of got in bed with the Pentagon and U.S. imperialism and actually had Green Berets and U.S. Special Forces troops embedded within their ranks. And they were the ground force which was fighting ISIS with U.S. air support. And when Raqqa was being bombed by U.S. warplanes from, I guess this would have been approximately 2016 to 2018. Again, I'd have to check the dates. Roughly that period. When Raqqa was being bombed by U.S. warplanes, it was in support of the Rojava Kurds, who were actually the force which took the city and continue to occupy it today. And at the same time, that the Rojava Kurds were kind of in bed with the U.S. Elements of the Arab rebels were being armed by Turkey to fight Assad, and Syria was just kind of being turned into this chessboard. With Assad being backed by the Russians, the Arab rebels being backed by Turkey, and the Kurdish rebels being backed by the United States. Not to fight the regime, but to fight ISIS. I know, kind of complicated. But the burgeoning Turkish dictatorship of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, of course, was militantly opposed to the Rojava Kurds because they were allied with the PKK, which was, the Kurdish rebel group within Turkish territory. So this had the effect of pitting the Kurds and the Arab rebels against each other. And they actually went to war with each other. And this is, had the, to my mind, very, very frustrating effect of kind of, pitting the Arabs and the Kurds against each other in Syria, which is a very, very dangerous situation. But even here in the United States and in Europe and so on, already the people who on the left who were dissidents from the mainstream hegemonic position of the left, which was in support of the genocidal dictatorship of Bashar Assad. We were already a minority. And even we were kind of like pitted against each other between those in groups like the one I was involved in, Syria Solidarity in New York City, who were supporting the general Arab-led Syrian revolution, and the elements who saw themselves as in support of Rojava. Even we were kind of like pitted against each other in a very destructive way. And unfortunately, a lot of the anarchists who were in support of Rojava, kind of bought the tanky line about the general, Arab-led Syrian revolution, that it was all jihadist or CIA astroturf, which was dangerous bunk. And similarly, a lot of the people who were in support of the general Arab-led Syrian revolution started viewing the Rojava Kurds as, unreconstructed Stalinists and pawns of U.S. imperialism. So really, really dystopian. So I kind of found myself to a certain degree, a dissident from both camps. There was also for a while a group called Rojava Solidarity in New York City. I was involved with that as well. I think that kind of went into abeyance, but I kind of found myself a bit of a dissident from both factions. So, but here we are at a very interesting and dangerous moment, both in Syria and in the United States. I mean, on one hand, when the regime finally fell last December, and scenes which should make any anarchist happy were seen of literally the prison gates being thrown open, and the prisoners surging, political prisoners surging forth from from their cells to participate in the revolution and building a new society, and the mass graves being uncovered, and so on. All very inspiring. And it seemed, and I would like to use the present tense, still seems that the actual leadership, which took state power in Damascus around Ahmed al-Sharat, despite their Islamist roots, they seem, I'll be optimistic and use the present tense, seem to be leaning in a more secular, pro-democratic direction. Nonetheless, we've now seen, these terrible reprisal massacres, first back in March against the Alawites, who were perceived as being in the, the Assadist camp. And now more recently, these, mutual massacres between the Druze and the Bedouin in Suwaida just this past week. So this is all very, very worrying. And you've got Israel intervening in the south now, ostensibly on behalf of the Druze, just like Turkey intervened on behalf of the Arabs and the U.S. intervened on behalf of the Kurds. So Syria continues to be, treated as a chessboard by the great powers. And there's still the potential. There's, I would like to think, still potential for the progressive secular elements that, I've been working to support all these years actually coming to the fore and being a part of building a new society. There's also definitely potential for ethnic and sectarian war. It can't be denied at this point. That potential is there. And meanwhile, you've got the genocide in Gaza, and you've got the United States finally going over the edge into fascism. I mean, literally fascism. I would say that we're not quite there yet, but we're definitely at the edge. I would say the fascists are in power. I definitely think that Trump is a fascist, and that the Republican Party has become a fascist element, a fascist organization at this point. He hasn't quite been able to consolidate his program. So we aren't a fascist state yet, but fascists are in power. There's still a certain degree of effective resistance, both, in the streets and from the judiciary and so on, which has prevented him from completely imposing his program. But we're poised right at the very, very brink. And we're, going deeper. He's testing the water to see how much he can get away with. And he's getting away with quite a lot. He's getting away with establishing concentration camps like Alligator, Alcatraz, and, these mass deportations now to El Salvador and South Sudan and so on. So extremely dangerous moment in this country. And, I pointed before to the turning point years, which were kind of big lurches to the right that I've experienced in my adult life, 1980 with the Iran hostage crisis and the election of Reagan, and then 2001 with 9/11 and the whole, launching of the GWAT, Global War on Terrorism, and the whole paroxysm of Islamophobia and jingoism and so on. What we're looking at now puts all that to shame. And what we're looking at now is just, a whole new level. So an extremely dangerous moment. And in some ways, I've been heartened by the mass protests which have emerged. A lot of people have been very critical of the whole 50-51 movement and no kings and so on, as, beholden to the Democratic Party and so on, and insufficiently radical. But, ironically, a lot of the people who are making that critique, I would say, are insufficiently radical themselves, because they're sort of engaging in this false equivalism, which is portraying MAGA and Trump as more of the same, which it is not. It is something which is qualitatively worse than what we've seen up to this point in this country. I think that it's important to participate in the actually existing resistance. And unlike some people on the radical left who sneer at the term resistance, I do not. I embrace the term resistance. And if that, resistance is too beholden to the Democratic Party or has illusions about the Democratic Party, well, we have to struggle within the resistance and make it a, pro-democracy movement with a small d rather than a big D. and make it, fundamentally about, small d democracy and human rights, and not about, rallying around a particular party. And that goes for, the alphabet soup parties of the sectarian left just as much as it goes for the Democratic Party. But nonetheless, resistance is what is urgently mandated at this moment.